This isn't a mindfulness retreat for an entire weekend or days in a shack by a lake where all you're doing is meditating, and that can work for some people. Most of us don't have time. It's the pause for a minute or two to say, how am I doing? What can I do to be a little bit better in this area or in this area?
Okay, so I have a question for you, Peter.
Okay.
With all of the things we've been talking about to build effective relationships, what's the one thing that people need to keep in mind as they build and strengthen relationships with others? What would you say?
The one most important thing people need to do to build strong relationships with others is to approach them from the perspective of curiosity. Listen intently, to be curious, to understand where they're coming from. If you do that, it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about a business issue or we're talking about a social issue. If you approach that from the perspective of, I want to learn and see things from your vantage point, I'm curious to learn. What is the data that you have based your opinions off of? Because it may be different than the data I'm basing my opinions off of. So when we have that opportunity to approach it with a perspective of curiosity, fabulous things happen.
Oh, it's a beautiful insight, especially to juxtapose it with critique or judgment, because so often we're trained or we are assuming that we go in and critique it or judge it or moralize it, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, instead of having that initial impression be one of, what can I learn? How can I appreciate this? How can I explore this? How can I understand this better? Two perspectives, and that's a fundamental choice. Also,
Really is.
here's another question for you. And let me frame this up and get your reactions then.
Sure.
If somebody were to ask me, what's one of those key parts of building relationships, I would say keeping in mind that every conversation happens at two levels. You have the content level, whatever it is we're talking about at the moment, who's coming to the meeting, when are we showing up at this event, or what's going to be happening next month on the project team. That's the content. But there's always a relationship level in every conversation. And it's those questions that we're continually asking ourselves. Do they like me? Do I like them? Do they believe I belong here? Do I want to belong here? Am I making a difference in their eyes? Do they want me to make a difference? Those are the deeper relationship aspects.
Yeah.
And I find whenever people repeat themselves a lot or need to get louder, that is usually a sign that we need to stop talking about the content and pause and start talking about the relationship. Because once the relationship is talked about and resolved, the content can move so much more quickly and more effectively. Peter, as you're hearing this, what reactions do you have in terms of your observations and how that impacts relationships?
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, it really is. And it requires conscious effort to be able to monitor both of those during a conversation. And it helps when you're able to put aside the focus on who's right and who's wrong, and am I right? And you're able to then just focus on strengthening that relationship, or I should say it more as understanding the relationship and not just the content. So you can't just focus on, well, what's my retort to what you just said? It's, I really need to listen to what you've just said. And now we need to put that within the context of what is our relationship? What is some of the history that could be leading to this? What are some of the needs you're doing? So it comes back to one of the gems that I love, and it's a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And a question well defined is a question half solved. And when you're having these interactions and they're asking questions, it's the clarification of where they're coming from at the content level. But then sometimes you need to dive down deeper at that relationship level to see what is really driving that question here. So I think it's a very helpful framework, but it's not always easy to balance. So you have to remind yourself. So Daniel, how can one remind themselves to pay attention to both sides of that communication?
Yeah, that is one of the great challenges in the hectic day-to-day aspect. And it gets at the support component and our habits. And one of the most effective ways is to then identify what are your habits that you do. And to then think through, all right, when I show up to a meeting, how do I start habitually acting and behaving? Am I open? Am I closed? Am I critiquing instantly? When I open up an email and it comes from a certain person, what are the cues that I start noticing about myself? For us to sit back and to pause and reflect, what are those habits that I do and show up in those moments? That's a powerful way for us to be able to change and to make sure that we are showing up in the way that we want to show up. And it also goes back to this great leadership gem. What is it like to work for me? What is it like to work with me? What is it like to work for me? We've been talking about these relationships. Maybe we can end here on what is it like to work for me? And how do we increase that level of self-awareness? And before I turn that over to you, Peter, I also want to mention everybody who's listening here, as you have other questions, as you'd like us to focus on questions around relationships or results or anything else, please, as we're commenting here on this final area, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A, and then we can chat through them, or you're welcome to email us later on as well. So go ahead, folks, if you'd like, chime in, write down your questions here as we're finishing up our conversation around this specific topic. Peter, paying attention to and that self-assessment, that self-awareness, what is the impact and importance of that in all of this?
That self-awareness, that moment to pause, to look in the mirror, is the absolute fundamental key to all of these things we're talking about today. As we've talked about critical relationships, that pause to say, how strong are they? What do I need to do to strengthen and to build them? As we've looked at how that translates into our leadership skills and the growth there, is the ability to pause, say, where do I need to develop to have the biggest positive impact in my role? As we've talked about communication with each other and that content and relationship, is the ability to pause, to say, am I looking at this? Am I listening and approaching this in a way that is going to be most helpful? As you have that time to pause, reflect, and think of what are my habits? How do I show up? It's fundamental. And in the hectic pace of life that most of us are living, it's forcing ourselves, it's scheduling that time to pause and have some self-reflection. Even 2 to 3 minutes of that. We don't have to say, this isn't a mindfulness retreat for an entire weekend or days in a shack by a lake where all you're doing is meditating, and that can work for some people. Most of us don't have time. It's the pause for a minute or two to say, how am I doing? What can I do to be a little bit better in this area or in this area?